Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here, and whether you're new or returning, I hope you enjoy the video. This week I'll be making a bulb from a Spalted Beech blank, 3-colour epoxy resin and 2 segmented rings for the rim. So without further ado, let's get into it. To make the 2 segmented rings, first I cut 36 segments, 18 from sapele for the top ring and 9 oak and 9 ash segments. These would be alternated to form the second ring. These were then sanded with 80 grit to remove the rough bits left by the saw blade. Then I assembled the ash and oak ring. I applied glue to all the segments and arranged them in a rough circle, alternating the pieces. The colours and grain are not that different, but it does give a nice subtle effect. And to hold it all together, I used a hose clamp to squeeze the joints nice and tight. The top ring went together in the same way, except this was all sapele, so I'll skip to the next stage. This is the Spalted Beech blank. I've had it for over a year and it's a bit punky, and I knew it would need stabilising with resin, so I thought this was the perfect project for it. But first it had to be cut to fit into the casting bucket. To do this, I marked a circle and roughly cut it on the bandsaw. I could have used a circle cutting jig to do this, but that requires a hole to be drilled dead centre, and this shows up in the finished piece, and in any case, the rough cut would be turned off on the lathe. So on to the casting. I'd made a waste block from scraps of MDF and softwood. This was superglued to the top of the beech blank and put to one side to cure. Next I mixed the epoxy resin, 3 batches of my favoured brand. You'll find an affiliate link in the description if you want to check it out. With both parts added to the mixing cups, I coloured each one with mica powder. I went with ocean blue, orange and apple green. These were then thoroughly mixed and left to pre-cure before pouring them. The blue resin started to gel much earlier than the other 2, but I had no choice except to get all 3 in the casting, and for note, whilst I was waiting, I'd primed the MDF waste block and waxed the bucket. I left the blank unprimed as I wanted the porous parts to soak up as much resin as it needed. Casting full, I put it in the pressure pot and left it overnight. It's the next day and the segmented rings are ready for sanding. I've done quite a few of these now and I'm getting better at it, so they don't need much to flatten them. In fact, they only needed 4 or 5 passes on each side and they were done. Then they were glued together using Titebond 2. Nothing difficult here, just apply lots of adhesive and place the second ring on top, with a bit of hand pressure, making sure to half bond the joints. I measured to make sure it was centred, used hot melt glue to hold it in place, then applied lots of weight, and it was left overnight to cure. With the segmented rings off to one side, I got on with preparing the main blank. The epoxy had cured with no visible cracks or voids, so I chiselled away the excess waste block, marked the centre, drilled 2 holes and fixed it to the lathe. For this session on the lathe, I needed to balance the blank and level the top. Using the Woodturning Tools full-size finisher, I began removing the waste material and exposing the beech blank. I wasn't putting too much pressure on the cutter because the woodworm screw was fixed into the MDF waste block, which on previous projects has lost its grip. The reason for exposing the blank was to see if the beech had been stabilised by the resin, and it appeared that it had. I could feel where the resin had been soaked into the wood grain. It's the darker patches, which was good news, but it had dramatically reduced the height of the resin on the top. I reckon about 1/3 of the resin had been absorbed by the wood, but it had done its job. I don't think I've worked with a blank so porous as this one. Anyway, moving on, I continued removing material with a bowl gouge to fully expose the joint with the resin and the beech. With the blank balanced, the next job was to cut the mortise, but first the base needed levelling and the resin removing. For this I used the full-size carbide and the skew chisel. To cut the mortise, I defined the outer edge with the 1/4-inch parting tool, cleaned out the inner material with a bowl gouge, cut the dovetail with a dovetail cutter and added some decoration. Then I sanded from 80 to 600 grit and added a finish just to the underside. Levelling the top was easy enough. The only part that mattered was the resin. The MDF waste block just needed to be dished out, so it wasn't in the way when I glued the top rings in place. To glue the top rings in place, I used rapid setting epoxy resin coloured with apple green mica powder. I applied it to the top of the heavier resin blank and placed it on top of the segmented rings, using its weight to squeeze the joint. I checked to make sure it was central and left it for 30 minutes to fully cure. It's 30 minutes later and time to get turning. I switched the lathe up to around 900 RPM and set about getting the segmented rings balanced and to round. For this I used a bowl gouge to shear scrape down to an even surface. To shape the underside of the rim, I stuck with a bowl gouge using a series of push cuts and shear scraping to create a sweeping curve from the resin up to the edge of the sapele rim. I used a small negative rake scraper to get it closer to the finished surface and blend it into the resin midsection. Then the skew chisel to square up the edge of the rim. Once the rim was more or less to shape, I moved on to the lower section to cut the pedestal. I considered other options, such as leaving it as it was, but I felt that because of the height, it needed a curve in shape to show off the spalted wood grain. When I'd cut as deep as I could with a bowl gouge, I switched to the 1/2-inch spindle gouge to refine the transition between the upper and lower cut line. After a bit of work blending the resin into the lower section with the skew chisel and a negative rate scraper, I reduced the diameter of the base. I'd hoped it would look okay as it was. The flash of orange resin looked good against the spalted beech, but it was just too big. Using the gouge, I shear scraped the edge, reducing it down to a more suitable size, and thankfully I retained some of the resin. As usual, reducing the diameter made the edge of the base thicker, so I thinned it down to suit the thickness of the rim, which allowed me to cut a little bit further in, enhancing the shape of the cutout. With that done, what followed was just a case of refining the shape, using various tools to blend and fair the curves, stopping every now and then to check my progress. When it was done, I sanded with 80 grit to check the tool marks and low spots, which revealed some between the two rings. This was dealt with a small and large negative rate scraper. Then I resanded and the outside was done. Shaping the rim and hollowing out was next. For this, I began with a bowl gouge, gradually removing material with a series of push cuts and shear scraping, concentrating on forming the curve from the edge of the rim down into the bowl. Having got the segmented rings more or less to shape, I broke out the 1/2-inch bowl gouge to remove the MDF waste block. I used the big gouge to cut as much out as possible in each pass, keeping the dust down to a minimum. And when I cut through to the spalted beech, I changed the tool post and switched to the side cutting scraper to remove what was left of the waste block, taking heavy cuts to cut ribbons of MDF rather than turning it to a fine powder. And when I was through to the resin, I used a full-size carbide to begin shaping the side down into the base. The carbide finisher fitted with a negative rate cutter does a great job of removing the waste material, but it does leave very fine ridges, especially in the resin. To minimise this, the trick is to keep the cutter moving and try to take lighter cuts as you get closer to the finished surface. After doing as much as I could with the carbide, I swapped to the skew chisel to refine the curve in the segmented rings, blending it down into the resin midsection. I used the bowl gouge to remove what was left of the waste block, and then used the negative rate scrapers to blend and fare the base into the side. A final go with a skew over the upper section, and that was it done. Well, almost. Sanding with 80 grit exposed a small void which needed to be repaired. I repaired the void with epoxy resin, coloured with green mica powder. This was allowed to fully cure for 30 minutes. Then the repair was cut back flush with the finished surface, and the bowl was sanded from 80 to 600 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit on the resin. Then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire Grit. A single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Then the acrylic polishing. First up, Mirka Polarshine 10. Just one application, thoroughly cleaned away with more paper towel. This is followed by Polarshine 5, another single coat, thoroughly polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. That's it, another project finished, and this one turned out to be really nice, and I hope you like it too. The Spalted Beech sits well with the 3-colour resin, and the segmented rim gives it the width it needs to keep it in proportion. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. A thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.